All right, all right, we're live. So yeah, in this webinar, we're going to be going over array lists and for each loops. So just to gauge kind of where you're at, Stephen, like how much do you know about array lists and for each loops as of right now? A fair amount. Okay. So like, are you comfortable with like the syntax? Do you know how to declare like an array list? Do you know, I guess, what you can put in an array list?
You can use your microphone too if that's easier than chatting, or you can just chat. That's fine too.
Okay, so you're not too comfortable with array lists, but for each loops are okay. Okay. So I guess then your computer doesn't have a
Oh,
microphone.
sorry.
Oh, we can spend more time on array lists if you want, if you're more comfortable with for each loops.
Mm.
So yeah, so I'm just gonna get started right away. I'm gonna share my screen and we'll get started on array lists. So is pretty much it's pretty much just an array, but it's also a list. So it functions both as an array and a list. It's called an array list because it implements this thing called the list interface. And have you learned about interfaces yet in school? That you say?
He
Okay.
said no. Yeah, we're gonna have another webinar later on, I think, going more into interfaces. Um,
Yeah.
but I guess if you wanted to like kind of explain it like really quickly, Stephen, maybe.
Okay. So an interface is basically it's kind of like a template for a class. And I say that very loosely because uh, things called templates in other programming languages, but like I'm not going to get into that. But it's basically just a template of where you would put like certain methods that you want like a class to implement. So like let's say you have like a lot of classes that do similar things like class you have like a like you have like a basic uh you have a basic list that you want to implement. But you can implement a list in like many different ways. Like you can have like an array list, a linked list, a stack, a vector, and it shows it right here. Um, but all these lists can pretty much do the exact same things. Like you can access an element at a certain index, you can set an element at a certain index, you can add elements to the list, you can remove elements to the list, and so on and so forth. And so there are like behaviors that you can uh, implement with a list. So an interface basically just lays out the framework of like what types of things you can do with a certain class. So in this case, when you implement a list, you're basically saying, okay, I'm going to implement these certain methods that correspond with the list interface. So does that make sense?
Yeah, he says a
Okay.
little.
All right. So, I mean, we're going to go much more into depth on it when we talk about interfaces, but
Yeah,
just for
right
right
now,
now,
like don't worry
just
too
know,
much about it.
yeah, I'm just going to give you like a baseline understanding of like what an interface is, and you don't really need to know what an interface is yet to understand array lists because
Mhm.
you just need to know like certain things you can do with an array list. An array list implements a list interface using an array. This means that it contains or inherits the code for the methods defined in the list interface. Um, and so it just goes on like what the list interface is, but just looking at the array list. Um, Hannah, am I going to go over syntax or
Um,
is
I can go over syntax
all right?
if you want to switch. Okay. So let me share my screen. Okay, so the syntax for an array list. So when you're initializing an ArrayList, list, you want to say list, or you can also say ArrayList list because like we were talking about earlier, the ArrayList list class implements the list interface. So where this list is here, you could also just say ArrayList. List. That's what I always do. So you would say ArrayList, list, and then in these little caret brackets, you put what type of variable you want your ArrayList list to hold, and then you have the name of the reference, and then you say that that is equal to a new ArrayList list of the type whatever the variable you want to use, and then you have your little parentheses at the end to finish initializing your ArrayList list object. And so, yeah, ArrayLists lists are a lot like just regular arrays. But so when you would want to use an array list instead of an array is when you aren't sure how many elements you want your array or array list to store, and also when you want to add or remove elements from the list, because array lists have methods that you can use to make it easier to set and remove things. Okay. So these are the list of ArrayList methods. So if you remember when we did our webinar on arrays, two of the examples that we went through were how to add an element to an array and how to remove an element from an array. And it was pretty tricky because arrays can't actually change sizes, so you really had to create a new array object. But using an array list, there are methods built in that can shrink or make the array list bigger for you, and so you don't have to worry about that. So the methods that you need to know for using an array list for the AP test are add, remove, get, and set. And so these are all methods of the list interface, which we talked about a little bit earlier. So the first one is size, and that just gives you how many elements are in the array list. So that is very similar to array.length, except this one, how we said that for an array, the length of it is a field of it, not a method. For an array list, size is a method, not a field. And so you need to make sure that you have the little parentheses because it is a method. And so then the next method is add, and this just adds another item to the end of the list, and it returns true if it can be added. And so then you can also, with that same method, you can specify if you don't want to add it add your element at the end of the list, but instead want to add it at a specific index, you can first put that index and then put what object you want to add. And what the array list basically will do is insert that element into that specific index, and it will shift the rest of the elements up. So like if you wanted to add a new item at the second index, but you already had, let's say it was an array list of 5 items, then it would put that element at the second index, and then whatever element was previously at the second index would move to the third index, and the one that was at the third index would move to the fourth index, and so it just keeps shifting them all until there is room. So then the get method returns whatever element is at the index that you specify. And then you can also use the set method if you want to replace an element at a specific index with a different element. And then we have a remove method that does the opposite of the add method. It removes the element at a specific index, and then it will push the rest of the elements down to account for that. And yeah, so those are all of the methods that you need to know. And so then some common mistakes for using ArrayLists are that the set method replaces the item at the index. So it's important to remember that when you use the add method, it's just going to add a new element while keeping the other elements all the same. But if you do set instead, then that is going to remove the element that was already there instead of pushing all the other elements up. And then you need to make sure that when you use the remove method, to make sure you account for that means that all of the other elements that were already in the array list are going to shift their index to the left. And then the opposite with the add method, remember that that is going to shift all the other indexes up. And then another important thing that some people mess up on is mixing up things for arrays and array lists. So like we have here, instead of in an array, you would use this type of syntax if you wanted to get a specific element, but it's important to remember that with an array list, you use methods to get the specific object in a list. So you would use .get instead of just putting the index in brackets. And then also, like we talked about, length is what you use for an array, but for an array list, it's important to remember that you should use .size instead, and that it's a method, not the field of an array list object. Okay, does that all make sense? Do you have any questions? Okay. Do you want to go, I guess we can still go through for each loops a little bit, unless, do you feel like really comfortable with them, or do you want to just have a little refresher on them? Refresher. Okay, do you want to go through for each loops then, Stephen?
Sure. Okay. Do we have like a specific example, or do you want me to just go through the ebook? Hello?
I turned my microphone off, I didn't realize. I just made like a little example on Java Visualizer that uses a for each loop to add like all the values and
array list
together. I mean, I can go through it if you want me to, it doesn't matter.
Okay.
So
let me see.
Or you could just like go through, I guess, the basic syntax, and then I could go through that example.
But I did the wrong one. Okay.
I'm just like over here.
Yeah, I can just explain like the basic syntax.
Okay.
Oh. Let me share my screen. Okay, so for a for each loop, well, a for each loop is kind of like a modified for loop. So like if you remember a for loop, you have some variable declaration, like let's say in I is equal to 0, I is less than 10, and this would be your condition. And then you have I plus plus, minus minus, whatever. And then you have some code in here, right? So you do something. Well, a for each loop is pretty much the same as a for loop, but you get rid of this index. In that there's something behind the scenes that basically says, okay, we don't need an index. We're just going to do some action for each element in some list. So the basic syntax for that would be for type You say variable name, and then you put a colon, and then you put some list. And let's say some list is just some list that you have. So like, let's say I created an array list of strings called names. It's a new array list string. So if I was to use names, then I'd put names into where I put some list because names is a list. And since it's an array list of strings, the type would be string. And then for the variable name, I could just leave it as variable name, but I don't know, just to make it easier, I could call it name. What this literally reads is that for each name in names, do something. So a for each loop, basically, it gets rid of the index and it makes it a lot easier because you don't need to know the length of the names array. It'll pretty much say, okay, for each string that's in names, do this code. So stop, but it'll know when to stop. So that's basically what a for each loop is. And you can go over your example now.
Okay. Let me show my screen. Okay, so this is an example that goes through a for each loop using an array. So basically what we are doing is we have an array of values, and this program is going to find the average of these values. So we're starting in main, and we declared an array with these values. And so then we want to print the average. So we're going to go into this method that I created, just called getAverage. That's going to take in our array. So then we have a variable called total that is going to add up the sum of all of the values. So then we're going to go into our for each loop, and what that is going to do is it's saying for every value that is in our array of values, we're going to add that value to the total. So it's going to go through, and it's adding every value in the array. And then we're going to return the sum of all of those divided by how many values there are, because that is the formula to get an average. And so the average of all of those is 6.4. So does that make sense? Yes? Okay. Yeah, so for each loops are just nice when it's something like that, where you know that you are going to have to go through all of the elements in something because it just automatically does it for you. So now we want you to try to do a little example. So I'll copy it into the text box, the Google Chat, sorry. So basically what we want you to do is write a method that prints all the negative values in a given array list of integers. And we want you to try to do that using a for each loop to go through all the values in an array list. So we're going to give you a couple of minutes to try to do that, and then we can go over it. Let us know if you have any questions.
Oh, you don't know what it means by all negative values?
Um, so basically, let's say that you had an array list with the numbers 3, 4, -2, -1, and 0. That means that what the program would do is it would go through all of those values and it would figure out which ones are negative. So I think I said -1 and -2, and it would print out those negative values. Does that make sense? So like if you were given, I'll type it in the chat, an array list of like 1, 3, -5, -4, and 9, then the program, after it completes that method, would print out -5, -4, because those are the negative values that are in the array list. All right, do you still need more time, or are you confused? Do you want us to go over it? You're stuck? Okay, would it help if we just went over it then? Okay. So I'll share my screen and I'll show you how I did it. So this is how I solved the problem. So I have a method called getNegs, and it takes in an array list called values. And so then I'm going to use a for each loop to go through it. And so for all of the vals in values, So I'm just I'm just going to call all the items val, and they're all integers, and we're going to go through all of them in the array list values. And so we're going to go through all of those, and if that val is less than 0, which means that it's negative, then we're going to print it out. So if we go through it, so just in main, I created an array list of just some random integers that I picked. So we're going to add to this array list values all of these numbers, and then we're going to go into our method. And so first it's going to check the first val, which is 2, and 2 is not less than 0, so it's going to go to the end of the loop, then it's going to go back up, and now it's going to check the second element in values, which is -6, and -6 is less than 0, so it's going to print that out. You can see down here. And then we're going to go back up, and the next value is 7, which is not less than 0, so we're going to go back up. The next value is -12, which is less than 0, so we are going to print that out. Then the next one is 5, not less than 0. And then that is the end of the list, so the for each loop is going to end. And so we end up with this output of -6 and -12. Did that example make sense? Or are you confused about anything? Just confused on starting the array list. So when you say starting the array list, as in initializing it, like actually creating it? Okay. So let's go back through that.
Hannah, do we have an example like where we add elements to a list like individually?
I don't think that we do. Do you just mean like what I do here, like in main, or? Or do you mean something different, Stephen?
Yeah.
Okay. So just here in main, I'm creating an array list of integers called values. And then, so I'm just using the add method to keep adding elements to the array list. So first I'm going to add 2, and since the array list is empty, it's going to add 2 at the first index. And then we're adding -6. And so remember the add method, it just keeps adding on to the end of the array list. So -6 is going to be added on after 2, and then 7 will be added after -6, and then -12 will be added after 7, and then 5 will be added after -12. So here. So like just in the chat, I'll put, so first you would have like 2, and then if we were to look at the object, then it would be -6, then 7, then -12, then 5. So this is like what our array list object would look like in the chat. Does that make sense? Okay, so yeah, so then when you go into the method, in the for each loop, it's going to go through each of the elements that are in the list. So first it would go to 2, then it goes to -6, then to 7, then to -12, and then to 5. And then it sees that we're at the end of the list, so it stops. So does that make more sense now? Okay. Um, so should we have him try another example, Stephen?
Uh, yeah, I think we should do the other example.
Okay. Do you want to go through the next one?
All right. Okay, so for this example, I'm just going to copy it in the chat. So the example says, write a method that changes every even indexed element of an array list of strings to the empty string. And in this problem, you can use whatever type of loop you want. Just need to make sure that the method actually changes the even indexed elements to empty strings. So you don't have to use a for each loop. In fact, I would recommend that you don't use a for each loop. Oh, okay. So an empty string is pretty much if you've ever like declared a string, but you've just had like double quotations. So like if I was to say string s is equal to this, that would be an empty string. It's a string that just has no characters. Like it doesn't have any spaces. It doesn't have any, non-space characters. It's pretty much just empty. Steven, are you done, or do you need help? Still working? Okay, that's fine.
Okay, Stephen. I'm confused about how I would go about changing the values in my array list. So remember one of the methods that we told you about for using in an array list is the set method. And so to use that, I'll type it in the chat for you. So you have set, and then you tell the method what you want to set, what index you want to change, and then what the element is that you want to change it to. Does that help a little bit?
And what it says.
Kind of. Okay, so just remember that this method is you're just setting, it's just letting you set one of the elements that are in the array list to something else, which is basically what you want to do for this problem. So whenever you get to an element that is of an even index, you want to replace or set the element that was there to just an empty string.
So does that make sense, or do you still have questions? Okay. Oh, I understand how you're explaining it. So then what are you still confused on? Well, putting into practice is confusing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that it's I mean it's easy when like you're using like an IDE to program, because you'll have like autocomplete, and if you just type in dot set, it'll like pretty much just have like a suggestion of what you need to put there. I guess just like memorizing the API, at least the API methods that you need to know. So like set is something that you'll definitely need to know for array lists or just lists in general. Just with practice, just using it and just thinking about it in the same way that you use, like, let's say array at index I is equal to 4. I mean, that's pretty much your set method, because you're setting for index I. So kind of like this is the same thing as this. We kind of have to just see the parallel between that. Well, what do you have so far? Oh, um,
Okay. Um,
okay.
okay, so let's try to go through it conceptually, maybe. So, okay, the first thing that you need to do for this problem is that you need to go through um, the whole array list. So, what kind of, I guess, like element or thing does Java have that allows you to go through all of something? Like what kind of structure would allow you to do that? So not necessarily a for each loop. You could use a for each loop to go through all the elements of an array list, but just like a loop in general allows you to go through all of something. And so, like Stephen was saying earlier, though, for this problem, a for each loop probably wouldn't be the best thing to use because you're not going through, you don't want to do something to every single element of the list. You only want to do something to the even indexed elements. Does that make sense? So it would probably make more sense for this problem to just use a regular for loop because using a regular for loop, you can tell what index you are actually at each time you go through the loop. So does that help you a little bit, or do you want us to try to go through more hints? Mhm.
Yeah, definitely use a for loop.
Okay, so do you want us to keep going through it? But I was just confused on accessing the indexes to set them. Okay. So
Just use a set method.
are you confused about like how to actually set the elements to something else, or are you confused about how to figure out which indexes to set? Like how to figure out which ones are the even ones? Okay, so to set them, you just use that method. So you have your values array list, and so you just say values dot set, and then whatever index you want to set, and then comma, and then just the two quotes because it's an empty string. Does that make sense? Or does that answer what you're confused about? Um, so like for example, if you were at the second index and you know that's an even index, then you would say,
Hannah, you accidentally muted your mic.
wait, is it still muted?
No, no, it's good. No,
Okay, I think like whenever I start typing, like it mutes it for me. Um,
I think you have like some key like binded to like the mute.
oh, maybe I
Because like
don't.
I've noticed that like you've been unmuting and muting it when you're typing.
Oh, that's weird. Um, Sorry about that. But so you just say values dot set. So if you were at the second index, you'd say 2, and then your quotes like that. Did that help you? Okay. I'm sorry. So that works for your example that you gave of your values array. But let's say that you weren't the person that was actually inputting the array list. Like, let's say it was just like a user of your program. And so, so this would work definitely for your specific example. But let's say that your user inputted an array list of 20 elements instead of just 5 elements. Then it would no longer work because you're only looping through the indexes less than 5. Does that make sense so far? Okay. So what you could do to fix that is instead of saying I is less than 5, you can say I is less than values dot size, because that's going to give you the number of elements that are in your array list. And then to determine which of the indexes to set, because like I said, you don't know how many indexes it's going to go for, you could say if I mod 2 equals 0, because that checks if something is even. Does that make sense? How that checks for an even value? So to check here, I'll type it in the chat. So to check if something is even, you would do, so let's say we're checking if I is even, then you would say if I mod 2 equals 0, because that is checking if you divide something by 2, if it gives you a remainder of 0. And that's just like the definition of an even number. Does that make sense? And that's something good to know for the AP test, because a lot of times like they'll ask you to like do something if a number is even or number is odd. So that's like a good thing to remember. And so yeah, so you would check using this to see if the index is even. And so then if that index is even, then you would say values dot set. I'll type it. Dot. Yeah. Does that make sense? And so what you did, like you definitely had the right idea, and that works perfectly for the array list example that you gave. But this is just like if you had a program that it wanted to know how to do this for any array list, that's how it would work. So does that make sense? Okay. Do you have any other questions? Because I think that was our last example. You think you got it? Okay. Do you have anything else, Stephen?
No, I think we pretty much covered everything.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for coming to our webinar today, and have a good rest of your weekend. See you guys later. Bye.
See ya.